Oh, that's not gonna work. Can't see anything.
All right, and stand by on the video, and we are live in 5, 4, 3.
So, hey, welcome to our third, I guess this is our third live office hours. I'm Steve Swain.
I'm Adam Nemiroff.
And we've been on the road. We've not been here at Dartmouth, and so that's why we haven't had an office hour last week. Adam, where were you?
So I was at the edX Global Forum last week, which is an annual meeting for the folks that make MOOCs for edX, which was really neat. That was in Washington, D.C.
Okay, and I was in Louisville, or however you pronounce it, Louisville, Kentucky. And I have the pin on at the American Musicological Society's annual meeting, at which I attended a panel on Italian opera. I didn't give a talk, but it was very fascinating, and there were a number of intersections with the kinds of things we've been talking about in the MOOC. And as I said, shared with some people, and I think it happened to you down in Washington, there are people who know about our MOOC. What happened to you as you were talking about this?
So we'll get to this in a little bit, but I actually met up with one of our opera students down at the conference, which was a really great experience. But yeah, it's really interesting to hear people who knew of the MOOC happening and had at least come across it. There were some other folks from the music community, Juilliard. There were several folks from Juilliard that were aware of the MOOC and stuff.
And for me, it was kind of weird because I'm walking around in this hotel of about 1,000 of my colleagues, musicologists, and every now and then somebody would ask me, have I seen you before? And they have clicked on the teaser for this opera MOOC, and so they knew about it from that context.
Very cool.
So welcome to all of you who've joining us live, or who are going to join us later. And we hope that we have a whole bunch of questions that have come to us, and we hope that we'll have some good answers for you.
Most definitely. A couple of really brief housekeeping items. So how to ask questions during the live office hour. You have two options for asking questions. You can use the Q&A tool that's built into Google Hangouts, and you'll see that on the right side. Your other option is you can use the discussion forum that's labeled for the live office hour today. Memory will be keeping an eye on those and adding those into our conversation as we move along. We had a couple of brief housekeeping things as we're moving into the last week of the course. We want to update folks on some of the things that people have been asking us about. So all of the due dates for any course assignments, those will all be set to November 24th at UTC 12 a.m. So those are all in there and set up. For weeks 5 and 6, those will be self-assessed. We tried the opera individual adventures will be set up for self-assessment. So you'll be using the rubric that we've created and giving yourself a grade. We tried that out last week, and it seems to be working pretty well. The course will be available sometime after the 24th. We'll go into some sort of an archive state. We're trying to figure out the details of that, whether we keep discussion on and some of those features. We'll be in touch about that at the end of next week as we're looking forward to that. Certificates will be automatically generated as soon as grades are finalized. We're shooting to get that done on the 25th, but it might be a couple days within that, but definitely before Thanksgiving. And then one last thing, we have a hangout coming up next Monday, and that will be at 1700 UTC. And keep thinking about your questions as you're looking to the operas from Puccini and his contemporaries. And we'll address some of those questions when we meet next Monday.
That's right. In fact, we might have a couple of Easter eggs, too, in terms of other things that have been happening within our MOOC. It's hard to imagine, given how much work we've spent on this, that we're in the final week of the course, but maybe we're all ready for that. We'll see.
It feels kind of bizarre, and we'll keep an eye out. There is a course finale that will be released sometime next week, so keep your eyes out for that.
All right. So we have a photo from our course community. Adam, in fact, you're in this photo. Yeah. So how did that happen?
So last week at the Global Forum, I met up with our student, Marie Cheney, who works as the provost at UMUC in Maryland. And we had a great meetup. We met up for dinner and talked a lot about opera. Marie jokes around here that we didn't end up singing to the restaurant, but I think we both thought about it secretly. So we had a really great meetup, and it was awesome to meet up with a student from the course and to talk about all the work we've been doing and some of the insights from students.
Well, in fact, if any of you are anywhere near Hanover or in New York or Washington, D.C., and you want to meet up with us and you or even in other places. I'm going to be in Paris sometime next year. So there are opportunities to see us live, beyond this kind of seeing us live. So let us know. I've gotten a few emails directly from people in the class, and I've enjoyed responding to them. You've gotten some as well.
A couple here and there. Yep.
And so this is your class, and we are your instructors, and we live to serve. So, and speaking of which, I guess we're ready to tackle the questions.
Jump into some
and
questions.
In fact, the very first one is from that person you just saw. Online goes by Marie Anita C. And as I said, it reminded me of West Side Story. Maria Anita, it isn't true, not for me. So anyway, first question: the role of women in opera.
Yeah, so Maria kind of builds up to this question, but are there any operas where a smart, strong woman prevails? Is kind of her burning question.
And the question emerges because in a lot of these Italian operas, the woman always dies at the end, at least here in the 19th century. And as she says in her question, they're women who seem like they're going to be strong, and then they capitulate at the end. So what's going on with this? So are there any operas where there is a strong and smart woman? Yes, most definitely. But they tend not to be an Italian opera. But anyway, first of all, this is a plug for the discussion posts, because very often you can put a question there and there are very knowledgeable people in the wider community who can answer them. So just so you know, a student, Maria Mosuiu, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. She read Maria Anita C's question, and here's part of her answer. So she said, try Macbeth by Verdi. Not that Lady Macbeth prevails, but she's more determined. In the Brindisi, which is the drinking song, she's in total control of the environment. Then she talks about Rosina twists anyone around her pinky in Rossini's Barber of Seville. I've never made that connection between Rosina and Rossini. Boy, there you go. Even Figaro is amazed at her ruse. And so keep in mind, this is Rossini, not the Mozart. But yes, very much so. That Rosina, especially in Act 2, Figaro is like, who is this woman? La Traviata. If Violetta was passionate, she would have thrown Giorgio Germont, the father, out of her house. She chooses to leave Alfredo so her lover's sister can marry, now being again from a family not tainted by scandal. In other words, she takes control of the situation and is responsible for what's going to happen. She is more noble than the whole Germont lot. Then we get an opera not within our class, but here's what the student says in Bizet's Carmen. The main protagonist is a very strong character who does exactly what she wants, despite consequences and convenience. That's very, very true. And so she, in fact, dares the tenor to kill her, which he does. And here was another one. She says, as a stretch, Lucia di Lammermoor, a woman forced to marry a man her brother chose, while her lover leaves her to fight in a civil war. He arrives in time to curse her after Lucia signs a marriage contract. And I agree, that's maybe not the best example, since it's also the opera where we have the famous mad scene. We'll talk about mad scenes at the back end of this whole question thread. But I want to point out this, it shows the richness of the various discussion threads. So you post a question there, an observation there, and people in the community are going to come to add their thoughts. So let me add a few more operas. And again, as I said, Italian operas are a little bit harder to find. So I'd said Falstaff to some degree. You've got these strong women who pull the wool over both Falstaff's eyes and also Ford's eyes. And then you've got La Fanciulla del West, where at the very end of the opera, Minnie rides off to strike a new world with her beloved. But mostly in the mainstream of Italian opera, not so much. Other operas I thought about, Cherubini, his Médée, which is a French opera that gets translated into Italian. Anytime you have a woman who's strong enough to kill her children, there you go. Fidelio, another central female character, but she seems to get some of her strength from being dressed like a man. So that's a challenging one. So I would go to Richard Strauss almost inevitably if I'm thinking about strong female characters. So you've got Salome, you've got Electra, you've got the Marschallin, you've got Adriana, just replete with a lot of women characters. And Strauss loved the female voice. So there's a lot to love in those operas. Thanks for that question.
So the next question is titled "Reception of Innovation in Opera,"
and it's from the woman
and
who.
It's from
that's right. Go ahead.
Exactly, and it's from Maria Misui. Is that what we said?
Misuiu.
uh, were there moments in the history of the Italian opera when a major opera was a huge fiasco because the music was so innovative that people rejected it? And then parentheses, similar with what happened at the premiere of The Rite of Spring.
And so when I saw this question, I was racking my mind trying to come up with an Italian opera that failed because the music was so progressive. And what I kept on thinking is that it's almost counterintuitive because the impresario, the composer, the librettist, the singers, they want a success. Right. So they're not going to push the music so far out there that they can't get a success. And the story, the received story of The Rite of Spring and the famous riot at the first performance doesn't take into consideration everything that happened around that riot, because the night before they had a dress rehearsal, everything went smoothly. And the audience at that dress rehearsal was more typical for those audiences. It was Le Tout Paris is what one place called it. Seriously interested musicians, ballad-to-mains, artists, literati, they loved it. But what happened was, some of what I looked at, the star dancer of an opera 2 weeks before was a choreographer for this one. They didn't like the choreography 2 weeks before, so this was an opportunity to get back at him. They didn't like the stage manager. This was an opportunity to get back at him. Okay. It was hot. And a lot of tourists that were there. And so I think all these things collectively combined to make that a riotous situation, so much so that people couldn't even hear the music. I mean, the story goes that the dancers had to count out loud so they would know where they were. So people weren't objecting to the music. They had all these other things that fed into the moment. So now back to the question, are there operas that did those kind of things? There are a number of operas that seem to inflame people. The most famous one, La Muette de Portici, when it was performed in Belgium in 1831, helped to topple a king. But Italian operas, not so much. Well, maybe we'll come back and talk about how Verdi was received as a political figure, but we'll go on to the next question.
So the next question is titled Reviving Appomattox. And this was interesting. Being in DC last week, I tried to see if this was being performed yet, and it wasn't. So Philip Glass updated his Appomattox, which is about the Civil War, to include the Civil Rights Movement. Verdi updated operas too to reflect the issues in his time. The revised Appomattox includes Frederick Douglass and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Opera is a social machine. What do you think about the revival of Appomattox?
So again, the question, to what degree should we take an opera and change it so it has, it includes within it reflections of issues that are happening in the present day? As far as the actual revival, I would love to be able to go down to Washington, D.C. to see it at the Kennedy Center. So one of the first thoughts that goes through my mind is there are very few operas we have where the composer is alive who can make those kind of changes right now. At the American Musicological Society, we had an opportunity to hear from Kaya Sarayaho, who has, she's a Finnish composer, lives in Paris, has written a number 3, I believe, of operas that are continuing to live, and she has an opportunity, should she wish, to go in and update them to present situation. So I can think of John Adams and some of the things he's done to change a very controversial opera, The Death of Klinghoffer, to make it better conform with the events of the day. Verdi, as the questioner says, he updated operas, but most often it was because perhaps they didn't work so well. So La Forza del Destino, Simon Boccanegra, he comes back to them because dramatically they didn't quite work. He also, since we talked, I know Macbeth is a little bit later in these questions. So that's what's going on there, but not necessarily to reflect on the events of the surrounding environment. I'll leave that there. And I want to kind of tag on to the question that came right before. And I said I might talk a little bit about Verdi. Verdi was seen in Italy in the 19th century as a convenient figure around which to hang the idea of bringing all of Italy together. If you know anything about the history of Italy, you have all these separate kingdoms and dukedoms. In the 1860s, they come together and form one nation under a gentleman who became the king of a united Italy,
Mhm.
and his name is Vittorio Emanuele. And so people would go around saying "Viva Verdi," which meant, yes, they liked Verdi's music, but it was "Viva Vittorio Emanuele, Re d'Italia." So that Verdi conveniently spelled out these kinds of things. So he was a political man in that way, which is a little bit different than this Appomattox thing, kind of conceptualizing American history in new ways. Verdi didn't. There were moments where things that happened in Verdi's operas were used to help the Italian Risorgimento, like Va Pensiero and Nabucco. But for the most part, Verdi is revising because he wants them to be stronger dramatic works.
So the next question by Rick Mack, grand versus light opera. What is the difference between grand opera and light opera? Wouldn't opera buffa qualify as light opera? We talked a little bit about this.
Oh boy,
one, yeah.
Rick Mack, boy, the question is so simple, but the answer, I'm afraid, is going to be a lot more complicated than that simple question would presuppose. So, for starters, the whole notion of grand opera that comes into vogue in the 19th century to describe a kind of French opera that differed from the French and Italian opera of its day. And so, and I don't want to get into talking about opera comique in France, which is different than opera buffa and is different than comic opera. It all gets really complicated really quickly. But the idea of French grand opera is taken up in both German-speaking countries and Italian or lands and Italian-speaking lands, where you've got somebody like Wagner writing Tannhäuser, which very much reflects the French grand opera tradition. And then we can look at several Verdi operas, the most famous of which would be Aida, which really is a French grand opera that's sung in Italian and set in Egypt. So go figure.
Yeah.
Anyway, so it takes us a while before we can, even use the term grand opera, and opera buffa is almost a century old by the time we get there. The other reason why I find this question a little bit challenging is because we've got these companies in America called, blank light opera. And typically what those companies do is that they do a certain kind of operas plus musicals. And so within the American context, if you have a light opera company, what should I expect when I go to see them? And we could talk a long time about, well, what's the difference between operas and musicals? I'm not going to do that today, but I'm reminded, based on something else that came up as we were preparing, about an opera in English that we were just talking about, The Ghost of Versailles, which is called a grand opera buffa. So you get something like that. So they get really complicated really fast. So a great question, Rick Mack. Sorry, I can't really give you a good answer, but let's call opera buffa those particular kind of Italian operas and leave it at that.
So here's a question about faster operas nowadays. Jordi Prats Rodriguez asks, are operas being played at a faster tempo than they were intended to be? Which is kind of an interesting question. She cites they cite a specific example.
So yeah, and as I was looking at this, and we were looking at the questions this morning, and cites this particular overture in the score, saying it should take approximately X amount of time, but every time that every recording they went to was shorter than that. So that's the question of why it's longer. And so one of the first things I would do as a scholar would be to try and figure out what's in the manuscript, what's in the critical edition. Is that 10-minute thing something that Rossini put in there? Is it something that an editor put in there? And so that would help us to know exactly what's going on. So until I could do that kind of work, I'd be loath to make a comment on whether or not opera, in general, opera overtures specifically got faster. I'll try and look around and maybe talk to Pat Fiskin, our librarian, who's in charge of some of these things. We'll see if we can come up with an answer. If we come up one, we'll answer it again in our hangout next week.
So here's a question from Danny ST. Politically correct ? I could not ignore the fact that in a lot of operas, you have more or less political topics. Often the librettist criticizes the political system, sometimes open and direct, sometimes hidden. Did this cause or result in problems for the composer?
Not so much for the composer, but definitely for the librettist.
Yeah.
And so one of the things we haven't talked about at all in our introduction to Italian opera is that there are these people involved called censors. And these people are just like what happened in the American film industry in the 1930s. Those of you who've hung out with us before know I like film. And so in 1934, there's the Hays Code that gets put into place in this early time of sound, early sound film, because the films going from the 1926 to 1934 were just getting so racy that so it's like, okay, we're going to make you happen. So if you have any bed scenes, you have to have 1 foot on the floor. So there are all these kind of interesting things that take place with the Hays Code. In the same kind of way, in Italy and all these countries, you have censors who are going to look at the libretto beforehand and say, okay, you can have this, but you can't have that. In Russia, for example, you can't have an image of a Tsar or, basically the Tsar. You can't have that on stage. In Italy, you have, a number of fascinating things. So if you look at specifically the history of Rigoletto, it's a great place to see some of this. So the librettist, his name is Piave, he's caught in the middle between Verdi, who really liked this story from Ugo, and the censors who are saying that the word they said, this is it's full of disgusting immorality and an obscene triviality. And so they're making him, they're making Piave change the libretto, but Verdi liked the libretto in certain ways. They didn't want it to have a hunchback in it. They didn't want the Duke to be so callow and stuff like that. Verdi insisted. Eventually, I think, Verdi triumphed and made some of these things happen. But there are things that get cut out. So, for example, Un ballo in maschera, which was supposed to be set in Sweden, for whatever reason, they thought, well, that's too close to Europe. And, the fact that there's this assassination attempt, we need to move it. So we'll move it to Boston. Like Boston makes any kind of sense whatsoever. But anyway, these are the things that where censors get involved. Librettists are the ones who have to make the changes, and composers then live with the ramifications. Did you all know all that, first student? I call Adam first student. So
I learned something new in this course every day.
That's right.
It's incredible.
Cool. Okay. So we have, another question from Marina. We had we read one of her answers, and so she's full of questions today.
Yeah. So Spain, land of opera. Why is it that so many of the operas are set in Spain? And Marina goes on to list a bunch of the ones that we've seen so far.
And yeah, I mean, we started in Spain with La Nozze di Figaro when we got to Rossini, and we looked at, kind of part 1 of the Figaro story. That's also in Spain. She lists Don Giovanni, Il Trovatore, Don Carlos, and why? And again, we could think of other operas, like obviously Carmen, which we've already mentioned. And as I was saying just now, if you can't deal with intrigues in your home country or nearby countries, go to Spain. Spain was a safe place to set all kinds of intrigue, because there was a lot of intrigue that happened in Spain, like the Inquisition and other kinds of challenging moments in Spanish history. But another part of that is to think of a lot of what opera, especially in the 19th century, likes to wallow in is exoticism. If we think of the later 19th, earlier 20th century, we go to China, we go to Japan, we go to India, even that exotic place called the United States. So all these places engage the operatic imagination. Spain was that kind of place in the late 18th and the first half of the 19th century as well. And so, I think of the contrast between pure Catholicism and raw sensuality. They get played out in wonderful dramatic contrasts. They exist in all these countries, but if we can put them in Spain, that's useful. One other thing to think about is that these are opera librettists and composers who are setting pre-existing plays. So it's fascinating that Beaumarchais and Ugo and Schiller are also setting their plays in Spain. So we could go back and look at these playwrights and try and figure out, well, why did they like Spain? And again, I think it's because it was easier to set intrigues that they were interested in around their natural environs in this faraway country that, they couldn't get at them. And so that's, I'd say, one reason why these stories are set in Spain.
So interesting. We have one question. Oops, I seem to have lost it.
But we have a lot. Overture, is that the one you have? Overture, prelude, interlude?
Yeah, we can go that one first.
Okay.
So Ceci MX, what is the difference between overture, prelude, and interlude?
A very straightforward question, and an easy question to answer. Overture, prelude, and interlude, and I'll start with the last word, interlude, which literally means to play between, is music that happens between scenes, connecting one moment to another. And in week 6 now, I mentioned the intermezzo in Cavalleria Rusticana, and that's a classic interlude. We tend to find the word overture more in the 18th and early 19th centuries than later. And the overture is typically before the opera begins. And as we saw in Rossini, overtures can be detachable and added to a number of different operas. But it's the first part, the band warming up and getting ready to go forward. And with Mozart, we get kind of specific overtures that have recollections of what's going to happen. Don Giovanni così fan tutte. But that's kind of where we are. I all of a sudden thought of Fidelio and the 4 overtures that Beethoven wrote for that opera. That's a fascinating story in and of itself. So prelude becomes popular in the later 19th century and going forward. So first of all, a prelude can be in a different act. So you can have a prelude to Act 4. Again, in our week 6, we're going to be talking, fleetingly about the prelude to Adriana Lecouvreur, prelude to Act 4 of that opera. But also then the prelude often opens the opera. So we had that in La Traviata, that's no longer an overture. And maybe an overture is kind of more throat clearing, rousing people's attention, whereas a prelude can have a bunch of different kind of moods, which we did see in La Traviata. So sometimes it means, if you see the word, it can tell you maybe when in all these years the piece was written. It can also then tell you something about the mood of the piece, perhaps. Probably not interlude. Interludes can be loud and raucous, or it can be quiet, all kinds of different things. So it looks like we have a live question here from Schuler T.
Yeah, and it looks like this question was quite popular. It was voted up. I think 3 people voted it up. Your course is a treat. Thank you. Are there plans for a continuation, like Intro to French Opera, Intro to German Opera, etc.? Oh wow, this is the perfect loaded question.
Schuler, gee, man, thank you so much and thank you for your kind comments about the class.
Thank you.
Really do appreciate it. I got to tell you, when I proposed this class, I mean, those of us who are on the starting of it, when I teach this class here at Dartmouth, I do teach all of opera. So I do it by language group. So I may have said this already, I teach opera in Italian, then I follow by opera in French, opera in German, the same order that Schuler T is asking, and then opera in Slavic languages. So we do Russian and then Czech, and then opera in Italian. And I know that leaves out Spanish, and there's an opera in Norwegian that I found, or Nielsen's Masquerade, which is in Danish. So there are operas that I don't get to, but that's what I tend to do, and it makes for a wonderful overlap. Now, that's what I wanted to do. I was going to have this class that I thought would last 12 weeks, and then we were looking at it, and it's like, I don't know if we can do a 12-week course. Yeah. And then if we trim it down, I think we can only do Italian opera. And so that's what we ended up doing. What I normally cover in 3 weeks, 3.5 weeks here at Dartmouth, I decided to cover in 6 weeks. And it's quite different the way I've ordered things here in this course. So I don't know, we've toyed with the idea, and, it depends on the success and what the resources are here at Dartmouth for doing that. But I guess I'd say to you, those of you who said this is write to edX, write to Dartmouth and say you'd really like to see this again. I think we'd be willing to give it another go. We learned a lot doing it this time. And there's a lot of wonderful opera in all these different languages that I would love to talk about.
Definitely. And I'll throw in one other pitch for sometime during week 6, we'll be releasing the final survey for the course, which is a great opportunity to give us this kind of feedback. So we're looking forward to hearing more from you.
Okay, so I also, and what you just said, I have to talk about the pun that we've had in the class. I don't know how many people picked up on it. So you said there's this wonderful, what was the word in the survey? A wonderful?
I totally blanked out.
Opportunity.
Oh, an opportunity. No.
Yes, and so
not another pun.
That's right. So we've been having you do these opportuning exercises, and it was always about this is an opportunity. So if you have a better pun than that, or you have puns about opera, put them in the survey as well.
We're always collecting.
That's right. We're pun collectors. Totally.
Oh,
So from puns to the least punning operas, play in the world, and that is this one here.
on to Macbeth. So
Oh, you said the word.
Russell 633 asks, I have been watching Macbeth and find that very many of the available productions are innovative. This does not seem to be the case for other operas like Simone Boccanegra. Is there a reason why some operas attract so-called modern interpretations?
And my short answer is not really. Much will depend on the creative team that surrounds an opera.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it will depend on where the opera is being mounted. So for a time there in both West and East Germany, they did what people call Regietheater. So the director was kind of the driving force to create new manners of stories that are presented. The Metropolitan Opera in New York City has, over its long history, tended to be one of the more conservative opera houses that would lean toward traditional productions, but even they have been moving toward more cutting edge productions. I'm so looking forward to seeing Lulu live. I'll be down there later this month, the William Kentridge production. And I saw also live Shostakovich's The Nose. And so, crazy, remarkable, inventive production. Some of us also saw Otello, back to Italian opera, the new production. I think that's a Bart Scher production. And, I didn't get to see it live, but there were folks here at Dartmouth. We watched the Met HD simulcast, and some of our seasoned opera goers were very distressed that it wasn't more traditional. The sliding transparent panels I thought was brilliant.
Cool.
And besides, Otello's my favorite opera, and I just was reduced to tears at the very end. As far as the Scottish opera, I won't say the name of this particular one. I wonder if it's because we've lived with this particular work for 500 years now.
Yeah, wow.
So that it just comes to us in more modern guise. I guess it's 400 years. It comes to us in more modern guise now. But there's no rhyme or reason why this opera gets modernized and this one gets, is there such a word, traditionalized? So anyway, that's what I'd say about that. It looks like we have one last question. It says it's a staff question, but I'm going to say it's Memory's question. Yeah, that's right.
It's Memory's question.
And Memory, for those of you who don't know, in addition to being one of our staff TAs, is also a quite talented soprano. And so she loves mad scenes. And so this was her question.
Many students enjoyed the mad scenes in Lucia di Lammermoor and I Puritani. Can you tell us a little bit about the origins of this convention?
And so, when I saw this question, I didn't know it was from Memory at first. It's like, boy, what a kind of a slow pitch over the home plate here, because I've done a whole presentation on mad scenes. The local opera company was doing Lucia di Lammermoor, and so it was an opportunity to talk about that. But then there was also the history of mad scenes that develops, and there are fascinating ones. I showed them one from an opera I would dare say most of the people listening has never heard about, Meyerbeer's Dinora, which has this just tremendous radical mad scene. So Memory, you got to look at that. But they go back to the 1620s, and so and it's a particularly wonderful dramatic moment, that somebody loses their reason. How do you portray that on stage and write music that's going to be able also to get at that? So from the 1600s to the present day, we see these mad scenes. They were particularly in vogue from about 1824 to 1847. So we just talked about the Scottish opera, so there's a kind of a sleepwalking scene in that's kind of a mad scene. And they often have a convention. We, back to week 3 here, we didn't talk about the convention of mad scenes, but very often, not always, but very often you will have the singer interacting with a solo instrument of some kind. So there in Lucia, you've got the flute and the singer. In another mad scene, I think it's in Il Pirata, you've got an oboe interacting with the singer. So you get this kind of interesting interaction happening. So what I'm going to do is put on in the listener's toolbox a list of mad scenes. And so for those of you who liked mad scenes, You can go crazy. I guess that was
Yeah,
a pun. That was a pun. You can go crazy. Looking up all these mad themes from Monteverdi to Corigliano.
Very cool.
All right. So I think that does it for our office hour for the day.
I think it does.
Okay. I think I did the thank yous last time, so it's your turn this time.
Thank you to Jones Media Center for giving us this beautiful space to use. Thank you to Dan Maxwell Crosby for operating the camera. Thank you to Memory for helping us to pull together all of your awesome questions. Thank you to Mike Gasward for switching between our streams and making sure we're showing the right things. And thank you to you, Steve.
And you, Adam, as Marie Cheney said about you, you awesome, tremendous instructional designer. Those of you who've loved this course, you need to thank Adam for doing it. And we've not talked much about this. I do want to say this. I mean, tell us a little bit about your background in opera before you came to this course.
Not at all.
Not at all? You don't? What did you mean by that?
So I had never seen an opera. I remember playing the Barber Seville's Overture in band in like 7th grade, but that was my only exposure to opera previous to the course that I could recall. So this has been an incredible year in the making, and I've learned so much about opera and music. It's been incredible. Thank you for that.
So do you like opera?
I love opera now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I mean, sometimes you refer to yourself as an opera dork.
I'm definitely an opera
All
dork.
right, well,
I'm getting there. Not
okay,
as much as some of our community members, but
well, yeah. And so for those,
I feel like I'm getting there.
Okay, so for those of you who are dorking out in our community, we thank you for being a part of our live office hour, and we'll look forward to seeing you next Monday, our last live office hour, as we kind of wrap up what's been a tremendous adventure learning about Italian opera with you. All right?
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
See you later.